John D. Rockefeller was the most powerful man in the world, but his reputation seemed a little too squeaky clean to be true. Newspaper magnate Joseph Pulitzer offered $8,000 to whoever could dig up dirt on the oil baron, and his darkest secret ended up being revealed. John Davison Rockefeller came from painfully humble beginnings. He and his 5 siblings lived in near poverty with their mother Eliza. A homemaker, she did everything she could to squeeze every penny and make ends meet for the family. His dad was a notorious crook and the source of the family's money problems. William Avery Rockefeller was far too distinguished of a name for a man like John's father. He much more often went by Big Bill or Devil Bill. Though he held down countless jobs in his day, he mainly made his keep as a travelling salesman, dubbing himself a botanic physician with a vast collection of dubious elixirs that could fix whatever ails ya. Family was pretty low on Devil Bill's list of priorities. He abandoned his wife and children on a regular basis to chase some shady scheme or another, leaving Eliza to look after the children. Between the births of John and his sister Lucy, Bill had an affair with his housekeeper, Nancy Brown. She became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter who didn't survive infancy. Devil Bill was in love with Nancy Brown from the start, but there was just one problem. She was dirt poor, and if there's one thing Devil Bill cared about, it was money. When Eliza Davison's father offered him $500 to marry his daughter, he couldn't say no. And with that, he doomed 2 women and 8 children. What a nice fellow. Although John D. Rockefeller was deeply ashamed of his disreputable father, he definitely learned industry from Devil Bill. The swindler would do anything if he thought it would net him a quick buck. When his elixirs weren't cutting it, he tried buying and selling horses. Once he bought a barge load of salt to hopefully sell it at a profit. No scheme was too harebrained for Devil Bill. When he scraped enough money together, he started loaning money to desperate farmers, but definitely not out of the goodness of his heart. Bill specifically tried to loan money at a steep 12% interest rate only to the farmers he knew wouldn't be able to pay him back. That way he could foreclose on them and take their farms. John D. Rockefeller's mother tried everything she could to shield her children from their father's influence, which wasn't that hard seeing as he was almost never around. She put up with his absences and his schemes. She even turned the other cheek when he married another woman, becoming a bigamist. Eliza worked to ensure life for John and his siblings was as stable as it could be, with a man like Devil Bill looming over the household. John was born to work. As a boy, he did household chores like all his siblings, but he also did extra work on the side. He started raising turkeys, selling potatoes and candy, whatever could earn him an income. Eventually, he even started lending money to his neighbours, at a sizable interest rate, of course. He learned that much from his father, at least. At 16 years old, Rockefeller got his first real job. He became an assistant bookkeeper for a produce commission firm. Apparently, produce commission was exactly the kind of sexy and exciting field that Rockefeller wanted to be a part of. When he was barely 20 years old, he decided to get into the business for himself. He and a partner formed their own company, but there was just one problem. While his partner had his share of the money, Rockefeller was $1,000 short, no small sum in those days. Lucky for him, he knew just the kind of person who would give out a high-interest, predatory loan to a naive young businessman. His father loaned him the $1,000 he needed to start his first business, and at a measly 10% interest rate. Maybe Devil Bill believed in his son, or maybe he just thought he'd teach the boy a lesson. But either way, he was about to learn that investing in John D. Rockefeller was a very, very good idea. In a strange way, Rockefeller has the Civil War to thank for his vast fortune. He happened to start his produce commission business as the fighting started. Since the massive Union armies needed a lot of food, his timing couldn't have been better. Once the conflict ended, he was well on his way to starting his fortune. But while Rockefeller believed in the Union and was a staunch abolitionist, that doesn't mean he believed in the cause enough to fight for it. The United States conscripted countless young men to fight in the Civil War, unless they had the money to get out of it. Rockefeller simply hired substitutes to fight in his place and focused on running his company. He claimed he wanted to join the fight, but he simply couldn't abandon his business. North and South fought on, hundreds of thousands of casualties piled up, and throughout it all, John D. Rockefeller made a pretty penny for himself. However, once the fighting stopped, Rockefeller realised that he needed to take a new angle. Fortunately, the war had also shown him where the future was headed: oil. There's a reason John D. Rockefeller is the poster boy for capitalism. He was really, really good at it. Not only did he get into the oil business just as it became the most essential and lucrative resource on the planet, but he also did a better job of it than any of his competitors. His dad taught him to cheat, his mother taught him to be thrifty, and these traits started to pay off big time. While Rockefeller's competitors were playing checkers, he was playing chess. He saw a future in oil, and he leveraged everything on it. Unlike more conservative rivals, he borrowed heavily and constantly reinvested all of his profits. He recycled the waste from his refineries and hired his own people, rather than relying on contractors. Soon he owned the largest oil refinery in the world. At this point, Rockefeller was doing well, but he still had his old business partners dragging him down, so he changed that in 1870. He abolished his old partnerships and formed Standard Oil of Ohio. His company soon became one of the largest corporate entities on Earth, but his meteoric rise didn't go unnoticed. As he forced more and more businesses to either join him or face oblivion, Rockefeller gained a reputation. The press began to vilify him, the evil businessman who laid waste to everything in his path. Rockefeller doubled down on his ruthless business tactics, culminating in one of the most infamous events of his career, the Cleveland Massacre. Competing oil men tried their best to resist Rockefeller's domination, but they just couldn't keep up. He was, to put it simply, just better at this than they were. If they didn't believe it, the events in Cleveland proved it. In just 4 months, Standard Oil bought out 22 of its 26 competitors. Everyone was starting to realise they couldn't beat him, so they might as well join him. Within a decade of getting into oil, Rockefeller was one of the richest and most powerful men in the world, and it helped shape his own twisted view of himself. If you asked the newspapers or any of his fallen competitors, John D. Rockefeller was a ruthless and cold-hearted man who swept up anything that got in his way. He saw it differently. He viewed himself as an angel of mercy who absorbed the weak for their own good to usher in a golden era of oil production. Standard Oil was a juggernaut, and no one could stop it. By the end of the 1870s, Rockefeller's company refined over 90% of all the oil in the US. If you think being rich makes you happy, then you should talk to John D. Rockefeller in the Standard Oil days. He got used to working long hours when he was just a boy, and he kept it up as an adult. It paid off as Standard Oil took over the entire industry, but as they say, all work and no play makes John a dull boy. He grew depressed and anxious. In 1880, the New York World said that Standard Oil was the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. But Rockefeller still didn't quit. He had one final mountain he wanted to climb. Rockefeller's greatest dream for Standard Oil was simple. He wanted to have sole control over all oil refining in the entire world. Now that would have been quite the feat, but he couldn't realise that fantasy. Rockefeller was forced to admit that controlling literally all oil refining might be a bridge too far, and the governments of the world would finally turn against him. He gave up the fight and settled for a measly 80 to 90% share of the world's oil market. But little did he know his company's days were numbered anyway. Though newspapers ceaselessly attacked Standard Oil and Rockefeller himself, little came of it for decades. Then, in 1904, a bombshell report changed everything. Ida Tarbell published her scathing piece, The History of the Standard Oil Company, which brought all of Rockefeller's shady machinations to light. Tarbell's article finally shifted public opinion firmly against the Leviathan of Standard Oil. Though he may not have remembered it, Rockefeller had a history with Tarbell, and she was determined to get justice for what he'd done to her family. Ida Tarbell's father had once been in the oil business himself, but like pretty much every other oil man in those days, he fell prey to Rockefeller's methods. Standard Oil ruthlessly took over Tarbell's business, financially ruining him. Young Ida Tarbell went from the lap of luxury to near poverty in the blink of an eye, and she never forgot the man who did that to her. Families like the Tarbells lost everything, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The business partner of Ida's father ended up taking his own life after Standard Oil decimated their company and cost them everything. She was just a girl when all of that happened, but now she'd grown up and she was ready to fight back. Ida Tarbell was a pioneer in the field of investigative journalism. She spent years poring over Standard Oil's books, uncovering secret letters, and digging skeletons out of closets. The result was The History of the Standard Oil Company, which laid bare Rockefeller's underhanded tactics. He may have tried to leave his past behind, but John clearly still had a lot of Devil Bill in him. Tarbell's report sent shockwaves across the United States. Standard Oil had evaded all antitrust legislation thrown against them so far, but they couldn't fight it any longer. Finally, in 1911, Standard Oil's monopoly ended. The Supreme Court forced Rockefeller and his associates to break up their company. So just how big was Standard Oil? Well, it broke up into 34 separate companies, some of which are still some of the biggest corporations in the world today, Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron among them. John D. Rockefeller owned more than a quarter of Standard Oil's shares when the company broke up. That meant he received proportionate shares in each of the 34 successor companies. Those companies continued to grow over the subsequent years, and Rockefeller grew richer than ever before. Within just a few years of the breakup, Rockefeller's net worth ballooned to over $900 million. There were two sides to John D. Rockefeller that seemed completely incompatible. On the one hand, he was a ruthless capitalist who laid waste to any competition in his path, amassing the greatest fortune the world had ever seen. On the other, he was a devoted philanthropist who considered charity one of his greatest callings. At 16, he was already giving 6% of his earnings to charity. Later in life, he gave away the vast majority of his fortune to universities, charities, and civil rights organisations. Say what you will, but John D. Rockefeller wasn't like the ostentatious, untouchable billionaires of today. When he moved Standard Oil's headquarters to New York City, he became a city institution. Despite the fact that he could buy and sell half the buildings in Manhattan, he still rode the train to his office every single day. Disgruntled New Yorkers would threaten him or beg for charity, and he essentially never got a moment's peace, but he did it anyway. Not all of Rockefeller's money was in oil. He invested in Colorado fuel and iron, and quickly revitalized the once floundering company. Like most things Rockefeller did, the move started making him money hand over fist. It also led to one of the worst stains on his entire legacy. Though Rockefeller would have you believe he revitalized the coal industry, coal miners told a different story. Fed up with low pay and lax safety regulations, the United Mine Workers Union called for a strike in 1913. The dispute dragged on for nearly a year until it reached a disturbing conclusion. The coal company brought in men from the National Guard to defend scabs and intimidate the strikers. It was only a matter of time before things got violent. The two sides eventually got into a firefight on April 20th, 1914. The National Guard set fire to the strikers' camps, and 15 women and children lost their lives in the flames. People called it the Ludlow Massacre, and many placed the blame squarely on Rockefeller's shoulders. He placed the blame squarely on the strikers, and regretted only that his company's men were forced to take such action. Even horrible tragedies like the one at Ludlow couldn't seem to shatter Rockefeller's impeccable image. However, rumours continued to buzz about the seemingly benevolent billionaire. Whispers that he was hiding a shameful secret from his past. The rumours about Rockefeller's dark family secret just weren't going away, so Joseph Pulitzer, the king of tabloid journalism, decided he was going to get to the bottom of it. He only had one clue. The truth lay with Doc Rockefeller, the billionaire's father, who was allegedly living under a false name. Pulitzer offered an $8,000 reward for any information about the man. Journalists spent 18 months on their frantic search, but they were too late. Devil Bill Rockefeller, who'd been living as Dr. William Livingston for years, managed to elude Pulitzer's hounds just long enough. He died in 1906 at the age of 95 before any journalist tracked him down and dragged his secrets out of him. Devil Bill was a swindler and a bigamist, but his worst crime was truly unforgivable. When John D. Rockefeller was just 10 years old, his father suddenly sold their home and moved the whole family to a completely different city. He claimed he did it to provide better opportunities for his children. That was a lie. He was on the run from the law, who wanted him locked up for violating a young woman at gunpoint. Shortly after the move, Devil Bill disappeared. Previously, he had borrowed money from his wife's father to bail himself out of jail. When it came time to pay the money back, he abandoned his family and never saw them again. This is when he took the name Dr. Bill Livingston, and he spent the rest of his life on the run. So not only was John D. Rockefeller's father a despicable predator, but he cowardly fled, leaving his family destitute. No wonder Rockefeller wanted to erase his father's name from history forever. Eventually, the constant stress and anxiety of running his empire left JD frayed and vulnerable. He developed stress-induced alopecia and lost most of his hair. He took to wearing a toupee in 1901 and lost his iconic mustache not long after. When Rockefeller was just a boy, he said he had two goals in life. He wanted to make $100,000 and he wanted to live to be 100. Hopefully, overachieving in the former made him feel better he didn't quite accomplish the latter. He succumbed to arteriosclerosis in 1937, just 2 months shy of his 98th birthday. His obituary in the New York Times reported that he'd earned approximately $1.5 billion in his lifetime, probably the greatest amount of wealth that any private citizen had ever been able to accumulate by his own efforts. Adjusted for inflation, most of today's billionaires would still have more money, but that's not the full story. At his peak, Rockefeller's wealth amounted to 3% of the United States GDP. Today, that would be nearly $650 billion. In your face, Bezos. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.